Welcome to Questions in Sustainability, a science-based podcast series that explores programs, people, and ideas in sustainability of food systems. I am Professor Paul Vincelli from the University of Kentucky, and I'm your host today. And we're going to be speaking with Professor Jules Pretty, who is a professor of environment and society and the director of the Center for Public and Policy Engagement at the School of Life Sciences at the University of Essex. So Jules, it's really a privilege to host you, and thanks for being on the podcast today.
Lovely to be with you, Paul. Thanks very much for the invitation.
Well, so Jules, this is one of those interesting and privileged cases where I'm able to speak to someone whose work I've known for a number of years and whose work I respect. And so you are, I'm sure you do a lot of things in your position, but the one that most interested me is the work on sustainable intensification and what that means and so on. So maybe before we get into the nitty gritty, why don't you tell us something about yourself, either anything about how you got into agricultural sciences or the thing you might like most about your job, or anything to sort of humanize the voice on the other end.
Sure. I started work in a university and then went out into a policy research institute in London called the International Institute for Environment and Development in the mid-1980s. And we were working with small farmers in many parts of Africa and Asia, in particular in Central America, on how to transform and change agricultural systems to make them better for them, so more productivity, but also ensure that in doing so, we didn't trash the environment. And from that kind of thinking about whole systems, whole landscapes, rather than just a field or indeed just a crop or an animal, we started to think of the system interactions and how you could design agricultural systems in such a way that you improved the productivity, which we all need, but we did it in a way that actually didn't just not do harm, but actually tried to improve the state of the environment in and around farms. And so that's kind of where we all started with this. And it's been, it's the dramatic changes around sustainability and agriculture that have happened in the last 30 years, a kind of human generation, they're great news. It's a good news story at the same time as lots of kind of troubling things have been happening. And we'll come to kind of some of those, I'm sure. But we know that it's easy to point at the difficulties that we face in all sorts of contexts, but at the same time, good things have been happening. So that's where I kind of started on this, and have been working on sustainable intensification, sustainable agriculture in its broader sense in many countries since then.
Yeah, you certainly have. I've seen your work globally, and I got interested in the topic myself back in 2014 when I was on sabbatical in Nicaragua. And of course, food security issues are big in Central America, and most especially Nicaragua. So I read work in this area, and I really sort of became enamored with the term sustainable intensification. So maybe a good next step for our discussion is to talk about what that actually means.
Sure. Yeah, I think that it was a deliberate choice of words. I think I first used it in a paper in 1997, and that was its kind of first recorded use. Others may have been toying with it as well, but I think that was the first writing down of it. And it was intensification to a lot of people sounds like a bad now. If we went back to the 1960s and the early phases of the Green Revolution, most people would have thought of it as a good, but it led to many problems. And so the word was somewhat loaded. But actually what we wanted to make the point was we needed to intensify the use of resources in a sustainable way. So to make better use of natural capital, of social capital, people's connectivity, trust, reciprocity, their capability to work together, and better use of human capital, the knowledge and skills and technologies that that we have in the broader sense. The intensification bit was to say, well, we can improve these capital assets that exist at particular places. It's just that in the past, we've tended not to. We've let agricultural systems damage social structures and institutions, damage farmers and farm families by creating greater inequality, damage nature and ecosystems in all sorts of ways. And none of those are inevitable. So the starting point was to say, hold on a moment, let's just think about what we want from agriculture. And we do need more from our existing land. That was kind of the starting point. Okay. The expansion of agriculture into non-agricultural environments, especially now in the face of the climate crisis, almost always leads to large environmental downsides. And so what we need to do is to take the existing land that we've got and think about how we can do better with it. And that's really the intensification argument. And for some people, it remains a kind of problematic term, but I still think it's useful to kind of, as the kind of point of the spear, in a sense, to say, look, this is the way we need to think about what we want from agricultural systems. Not saying it's easy, it's hard, but if we can think about the multiple priorities from agriculture, then we've got a chance to deal with this. And that's where the kind of sustainable intensification debate and practice has kind of led from.
Yeah, so for the listener who may be new to this topic, let me offer my understanding, and we'll see if it actually fits the literature that you've written. So intensification refers to agriculture where there's greater yield, greater production per unit area, right? And then extensification would be where increases in production come from the cultivation of larger areas of land. Is that just focusing on the word intensification? Is that
absolutely
an accurate?
Perfect? That's it. That's exactly right. Yes, okay. Exactly right.
Cool.
And both are kind of legitimate processes to increase the amount of food that we as humans need, but we now know that the amount of available land is limited. That if we do chop down thousands of hectares of Amazon rainforest in order to produce more soya to feed to our animals, there's a big cost to that. And so sustainable intensification really is saying, let's make better use of the existing land. And actually, the data shows this works. It's not a sort of, magical proposition that can never really be delivered or some figment of imagination. Actually, farmers are showing us that we can make these transitions, and it looks different in every place. There are different priorities. People have a need to focus on one thing or another, and the outcomes do look different. Irrigated systems, their transitions are very different to agroforestry based ones. Big farms are very different to small farms, and each of those has kind of illuminates these transitions that we need to make and tells us quite a lot about how we might then design policies, design practices, design advice from extension systems, all of these sorts of things to make more happen. Because ultimately we do need all our agricultural systems to be as sustainable as they possibly can. So
Jules, where does the term sustainable intensification almost creates like an animosity in some settings, and I think it's actually useful. So where does that, maybe animosity is too strong a word, but where does what's going on there with sustainable intensification as far as what it conveys to various populations of people interested in agricultural sustainability?
Yeah, I think the first point it does raise is questions about terminology. What language should we use to describe systems, and what do they then mean? And for me, I've always taken a kind of pretty broad church approach to all of the kind of language and terminology around sustainable forms of agriculture, and indeed transitions towards sustainability. In other words, not to argue too much about, well, my form of sustainability is better than your form over there. and that's not really sustainable, but this is, or our existing system, which we haven't changed at all, actually is really sustainable. Those sorts of claims tend not to help us all feel as though we're in the same boat and we need to be rowing in the same direction. They tend to pull us apart. So there's some really useful terms, as I was saying earlier on, when we started thinking about sustainability in agriculture in the 1980s, we were interested in agroecology, in the kind of agroecological relationships. And that's because some of us were ecologists in the first place, and we were used to ecosystem mapping and design. And an agro ecosystem is simply an amended ecosystem. So we applied agro and ecosystem together, and you end up with kind of agroecology because you're looking at predator-prey relationships, you're looking at kind of soil dynamics, you're looking at kind of allelopathy between plants and other plants, or plants and insects. So those processes go on within agriculture. So agroecology as a whole kind of science related to it. At the same time, regenerative agriculture has a long history. I wrote a book in 1995 called Regenerating Agriculture, which was a kind of play on the term. And it was about saying, well, we needed to regenerate the capitals that underpin agriculture because they had been damaged by past practices. Regenerative has become a kind of an increasingly popular term. I've even had a farmer not that far away from where I live in the east of England say to me on a farm visit last year, in between the lockdowns, and I visited him. He said, I've converted my whole farm to regenerative practices. And I said, oh, that's kind of interesting. He said, you should try it sometime. I was kind of going, oh, that's cool. I kind of wrote about this 25 years ago. So it's wonderful to see that. So this was, people kind of pick up messages from the internet, from advice from other farmers, and they say, I've got to give that a go. That sounds kind of interesting. And he said at that time, this has just made farming so interesting and exciting because there are so many questions. We've got to try and do this, we've got to do that. I want more swallows and swifts on my farm, so I'm going to do this and that. And at the same time, we're going to have different farming patterns, crop patterns, and I'm going to need new machinery. So there's all sorts of things. So regenerative is another term. And you'll hear, of course, organic. Conservation agriculture is another term. Sustainability in general. Quite a lot of people are now talking about wilding and rewilding, bringing wild things back into agriculture. And there's a sort of, popularity about terms. Beavers are being reintroduced into parts of Britain. Another farm close to where I live, just 20 miles down the road, introduced beavers 2 years ago in a paddock on the hillside. And it's used to be, the village used to flood just downstream, and now it doesn't flood because the beavers have created a whole network in 2 years of lakes and dams.
Wow.
25 dams, 3 lodges, changed the landscape completely. And now that farm provides a flood protection service by holding the water upstream, literally, and preventing it flooding the village downstream. So we're seeing lots of kind of changes coming under different terms, and I'm just thoroughly encouraged by all of them. I don't have any arguments about terminology. I never really have had. If someone says I've got a problem with sustainable intensification, then I say fine, but I bet you haven't got a problem when we talk about the principles, which are about kind of producing, more food, enough food, but doing it in a way that does no harm, that preferably does good. And the people say, yeah, sure, there you go. So often the arguments are around kind of prior ideas of what terms mean, but actually underlying them, there's a lot of similarities.
Yeah,
so I'm quite comfortable with all of that.
Yeah, I think you hit sort of the nail on the head. I think that the use of the term sustainable intensification evokes sort of the large-scale corporate farming structure, which has strengths and weaknesses. We all know about that. But so that can bias a conversation right away and turn it into a negative sort of vibe. But I like your approach to to say, well, how do you feel about the practices that are implied by sustainable intensification? And I think,
Yeah.
I've tweeted on this once or twice. I think the term simply means more food from the same land produced sustainably,
Exactly.
which is
Exactly.
pretty.
And there's exactly, and there's a kind of slight angle to that which you could add. I think there is a kind of Hippocratic oath here. I mean, all doctors take a Hippocratic oath: do no harm. So you could say that's the first level of sustainability: do no harm. But actually, because harm has been done in the past, and because there are trade-offs between aspects of agricultural systems, we need to do good as well as not do harm. And they're often different things. You could say, I'm going to cut the use of insecticides on my farm because of concerns over kind of health issues, or indeed the insect apocalypse that's happened in many parts of affluent countries. But actually, in order to have your biodiversity provide you with pest management services, to kind of put it in that sort of way, you've actually got to kind of intervene to put in kind of flowering strips, mixed crops, different patterns in the UK landscape, change the way hedgerows look, plant things to encourage insects, look for patterns of crops so that they can push and pull the predators and the parasites and the pests from one place to another. In other words, redesign your system. So I think that the first step is doing no harm. The second and third steps lead to redesign, to rethinking the whole of agricultural systems. And that farmer that I met in Essex a year ago was engaged in that redesign. As soon as he'd done some tweaks, got interested himself and thought, my goodness, here I am in my 60s and I'm kind of completely reinventing the farm.
Yeah.
He found that exciting and interesting because actually the story behind sustainability and sustainable intensification is you never arrive. The train doesn't get to the station. There isn't a station. There's a performance to agriculture, and we're going to have to kind of dance this forever because conditions will change, climate will change, economies will change, policies will change, markets change, and so your kind of model at a particular time moment might be looking pretty good, and then a pest comes along, sort of something completely new. Cornstalk borer appears in China 2 years ago, and bang, it changes all of their kind of system. So pests are going to move around, and they're going to be things that we can't predict. And so I think that we need to think of sustainability as being this kind of interactive dance that's going to need institutions and knowledge and capacity to innovate through all time, probably. But not, and that's not an excuse to say, therefore we shouldn't do anything. That would be completely wrong. Therefore, we should be doing stuff as fast as we can, but thinking that there's not going to be a point when it's perfect. It's not going to exist, I don't think.
So I'm sort of amused here because we have two professors who could talk for 15-20 minutes about a term, and enjoy the conversation. So the reason, of course, we're professors, so we're going to tend to do that. But the other point is, just for the listener's sake, is it's the terminology embodies concepts, and that's where it becomes very interesting, to us. To what do we really mean by this? So yeah, I think it's great to be able to participate in this conversation.
Yeah. I mean, to give a kind of bit of hardness to that, we did a study a little while ago looking at the transitions towards sustainable pest management, or integrated pest management, as it's been called for a long time, IPM, in 80 projects in Asia and Africa. And we found that the average yields in those projects had increased by 70%, 70,
Wow.
Over a 5-year period. And the average use of pesticides had dropped to about 20% of the previous level, and half the systems had eliminated pesticides completely. So that's a kind of hardness to this. That's what we mean, is that you can take away something that pesticides are biocides. They're intended to kill stuff. You can use them safely, but lots of times not. And lots of products are not safe in the first place. So they later on prove not to be safe. So if we can get rid of them, generally speaking, that's a good thing. But you still need ways to control pests and diseases and weeds. So farmers need to create systems that do all of that. And if you can get that happening, outcome is more food, less environmental damage. So that's the outcome. That's the sort of thing we want.
Yeah, and that I remember that paper, and in fact, the focus of the paper, as I understood it, was that sort of there's different levels of sustainable intensification, but the end, maybe not the end point, but the direction is towards redesign for the most impact, and
exactly.
redesign of the farming system. And IPM, integrated pest management, would be an example of redesign, basically. So
it absolutely would. And very often the first step for farmers is to kind of make changes to efficiency. We often talk about these 3 stages of efficiency, substitution, and then redesign. And efficiency is stop doing the stuff that's wasteful. Why apply fertilizers in a lazy way, which means half of them get into the water courses and run away from your farm? Target them if you're going to use them. Why use pesticides in a broad-based way when you could be much more precise about their use? So the first stage is about kind of, efficiency of operations, larger machinery with softer wheels means less soil compaction, means less problems for the soil. So that's the sort of efficiency piece. Substitution means you go, aha, all right, now I see an opportunity to take away one thing I was doing and replace it with another thing. So it might be that you put in beetle banks across your field because that's a way of using the grass strips to encourage ground beetles to control the aphids in the wheat. Well, that would be a kind of substitution kind of thing. And then the third stage is this redesign. It's where you kind of then sit back and say, oh, crikey, in order to get the best from, let's think about water, the use of water on the farm here, we're going to need to think about how we capture water when it does rain and make use of it better, and how we're going to make control both too much water and too little, how we're going to work with neighbors to make sure it happens at a landscape level. And very quickly it's a pretty big rethinking of the way stuff works. And that's what we mean by redesign. And ultimately, I think that's what we all should be trying to do.
We'll be doing. Yeah. We'll come back to that subject. So let's take a short break for a musical interlude to refresh the mind. It's just something I enjoy doing in my podcast. And when we come back, we'll be continuing to speak to Professor Jules Pretty, who's a professor at the University of Essex in England, of course. And I forgot to mention that he is an author not only of some very influential scientific papers, but also several books, including The East Country from Cornell University Press, winner of the 2018 East Anglian Book of the Year Award, The Edge of Extinction, which sounds like a wonderful title, also by the Cornell University Press, and several others. In fact, he also is in the world top 1% of highly cited authors. So very cool. And Jules, thanks again for being with us, and we'll return in just a few moments. And we're back on Questions in Sustainability, a podcast produced by the University of Kentucky. Your host today is Paul Vincelli, that's me, from the University of Kentucky, and we are speaking to Professor Jules Pretty, who's a professor of environment and society, and it really has a very rich career, but is an expert in a concept. In fact, was the creator of or at least the first to publish on the concept of sustainable intensification in agriculture. Very, very fascinating topic and useful from my standpoint. So Jules, once again, thanks for your time. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Paul. A pleasure to be with you.
So there are a number of different facets that we could cover in the time that remains. And one that you talked about before we started recording, I want to explore a little bit again. That is generational changes in agriculture and the way agriculture is seen and understood and visualized by the practitioners themselves. Tell us what your thoughts are in that area.
Yeah, I think that if we take a generation to be roughly 30 years, 25 or 30, human generation, I mean by this, if we go back 30 years to 1990, this was when the atmosphere still only had 350 parts per million of carbon dioxide. That was a safe operating space for humans. In the one generation since then, it's gone from 350 to 417 parts per million. If we went back a generation from before 1990, we're actually at the beginning of the Green Revolution, 1960. So in those 30 years, we've seen enormous changes of good things, but also bad things, good practices, bad side effects. In this kind of recent 30 years, a growing acceptance and understanding of what sustainability means in all its facets, a growing application of the practices on farmers' fields and farms, and in some places transforming whole landscapes. So it's not just one farm over here and another pilot farm over there and another one in a different place. It's whole landscapes that have been changed. And I think that idea of thinking about kind of 30-year periods sets us now in 2021. We're concerned, very concerned about the climate crisis. We know we've got to make these dramatic changes to carbon emissions to head towards net zero as quickly as we can. The target for most governments, and certainly for the IPCC and others, is looking ahead to 2050. So another 30 years. So that's that kind of next generation. We're at this point where we look forward, and if things go badly, the wheels are coming off. Really, if we carry on growing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere at the same rate as the last generation, that's not good. To kind of underplay it, that's pretty terrible for us by 2050. And we've got to make changes really quickly. So this generation, suddenly we're served up with another major challenge. Agriculture produces about 20% roughly of the carbon dioxide equivalent emissions. So not just CO2, but methane, nitrous oxide are really big contributors to the climate crisis. And agriculture will have to play a really significant role, as it's a kind of a fifth of all production at the moment. And that will be right the way through the food system. It's not just at the point of production, but it will be at the point of consumption as well. What people do as consumers to transition towards more sustainable diets, which actually in the short term almost certainly means less consumption of intensive meat. And that has the biggest immediate impact. And there's substantial growth in people who have shifted towards non-meat vegetarian style diets. That's not to say that all meat is bad, but some meat produced in certain kinds of ways certainly is. So we're at that point where I hope there's another kind of generational change of sustainability in agriculture ahead of us. And I think I'd conclude this point by saying, when you think in those sort of 30-year periods, and as I've just been saying, good stuff can happen alongside bad stuff. So we've had trends of problems when it comes to the climate crisis, of inequality, of farm size differentials changing, of lack of access of young people to farming in many affluent countries, of damage to natural capital and biodiversity by farming, and yet at the same time, a rapid growth in sustainable agriculture in all its forms: sustainable intensification, agroecology, organic farming, conservation agriculture, lots of different types. And that good news gives me some optimism, quite a lot, that we can kind of say, well, actually, we found out ways to make this work. We just need to do it, 10 times more. And then again, and then we will have transformed agricultural systems worldwide and made them, carbon neutral and successful for the future.
Yeah, you're definitely the optimist, and it's gratifying to hear that kind of opinion being expressed, because the climate crisis, as you say, is if you get serious and really study it, it gets pretty worrisome. So I like your positive attitude, and farming is certainly able to contribute its substantially to that vector that we will take to reduce the very severe impact we're having on our planet. You also said something that struck me as basically saying these are exciting times to be associated with agricultural science and agricultural production because of the changes that are occurring and will continue to occur. In fact, you also said something that reminded me or emphasized the point that farmers really aren't, and consumers aren't, going back. I don't know what the future of agriculture will be, but it's not going to be what it was. So it's not going to be the conventional farming that we strictly that I don't know what it'll be, but we're privileged to be able to be part of it, certainly.
I absolutely agree with that, and agriculture could play really quite a big, significant role in pointing towards the way that people can work together to achieve change at least landscape scale, or across kind of whole regions. Some further work that we've done has been on the growth of what we call social capital, the relations between people, the institutions that emerge on the basis of trust and reciprocity and common rules, that have been very successful in many parts of the world to help manage irrigation water, manage forests, to manage watersheds, to manage drainage and systems, or pest management. Almost all of these sorts of priorities happen at a scale larger than individual farms. In certain places, the farm is the landscape, but in most parts of the world, you've got lots of farms in the landscape. And in order to deliver change at the larger system, you need cooperation. And actually, there's a kind of little sort of a story footnote to that is, in order to deal with the big problem, the climate crisis, we're going to need cooperation. So there's only one system boundary that really matters, and that's the planet. Step back a little bit and think of Anders and Borman on Apollo 8 when they first came back and took the first pictures that anybody on the planet had seen of the planet Earth, that marble against the dark sky. Well, there's the hard border. Humans had never seen that picture of the Earth before 1968, Christmas Eve, 1968.
Oh, is that when it was?
That's when it was. Yeah, they took that famous picture of the Earth rise, and then the whole picture of the blue-green marble in space. And so to solve big problems, we need cooperation. And the interesting thing about agriculture is that it has, in this last generation or so, helped transform a lot of rural communities by encouraging cooperation. And we think something like 8 million social groups have been formed in countries across the world, about 240 million people now working together, cooperating on kind of forms of collective action. Doesn't mean to say they're cooperating on everything, but if you want an irrigation system to work, you have to cooperate. I mean, the Subak systems in Bali that have been managing the 2,000 Subak systems there, the irrigation systems that run from the high mountains down through the kind of temples down to the shore, have been managed that way for 4,000 years. And they've been managed on cooperation. People work together and they say, well, person up the hill is not going to take all the water because person down the hill needs some. And so you have some rules and you have some cooperation. And so this emergence of groups actually is a pointer towards something bigger. If we can do it in agriculture, you can do it for other reasons as well. And that's I think quite a kind of important message.
So Jules, my hope is that the podcast will be picked up by graduate students in agricultural topics, social sciences, and as well as natural sciences, and listen to. What comments would you make to the body of graduate students out there?
Oh, that's a great question. I would say you're the future, you're the leadership. You each will have your own expertise and knowledge that you have developed and that you're also especially interested in, and they differ from person to person. But the complexity in agricultural and landscape systems requires lots of different disciplines to be working together, to be thinking about real world problems from different disciplinary perspectives. So that's easy to say, but not always easy to do, because disciplines have different languages and different terminology and different kind of cultural baggage almost, that coming to the table. I'd say the thing that works best is listening. Listen to the principles that underpin the words that are coming from other disciplines. And if people are paying attention, being attentive and listening, then they will find ways of cooperating and collaborating that can bring the power of their kind of knowledge and intellect to solving real world problems. And by the way, it can happen quickly. We were all young once. In the blink of an eye, you're old. And then you think, oh crikey, you know, sort of what kind of happened there? Well, actually, there was a point when we didn't know much and we were trying to make things happen, and then a little bit later you're reflecting upon it. So, you know, for graduate students, I'd be saying, well, what do you want to achieve? Be ambitious, try to change the world. Don't if someone says no, say yes, but also listen to other disciplines, because ultimately that kind of cross-disciplinary, interdisciplinary kind of approach to solving world problems needs all sorts of different people to listen to each other. You know, whether you're economists or geneticists or people who are working on soils or on anthropology or on institutions or on legal aspects. I mean, all of those are an important part of agriculture. So I think that be leaders and change the world.
Wonderful. Yeah, and I want to really emphasize the word listen as you did, and great advice. So last question, Jules, what have we left out? What would you like to add that must be said?
I think I would say that the one big thing is that we've been talking about these sorts of changes without a special reference to policymakers. And so we've got lots of kind of islands of success, things that are happening as a result of local institutions, local scientists, extensionists, universities, others making particular kinds of changes. But we need policymakers to say, yeah, we get it. The sustainability thing is what we want to do in the whole of our landscape. And so if we take the government of Andhra Pradesh, one of the southern states in India, they have said, and they've been articulating a form of sustainable agriculture called, first it was called zero budget natural farming, but it's now kind of called community managed natural farming. But it's natural farming is the sort of language they're using. It's just further terminology that we've been talking about earlier in this pod. And they've said, we want every farmer in Andhra Pradesh to be practicing these methods by 2025. That's our aim. 6 million. And the growth is remarkable. The impacts on the ground are tremendous. The soil regeneration, the biodiversity, the favorable insects and birds, the mixtures of crops, the yields have all been transformed on farmers' fields within 2 to 3 years of their adoption of these approaches. And the government has said, we want everyone to do it. And this is how we're going to help it happen. So that is a really interesting example where I think the bit that is often missing is then to say we need bold ambition from governments as well to get behind supporting sustainability and helping these transitions happen for farmers, putting in place incentives, putting in place kind of support, and encouraging our institutions, research and extension and others to help as best they can to make these changes. And then I think we kind of close the circle a bit, once we've persuaded policymakers to do the same thing.
Yeah. Great comment, Jules. What was the name of that state again? I've seen it written.
It's Andhra Pradesh. So
Andhra Pradesh.
It's in the southeast of India, and it's a kind of system that has been called ZBNF, Zero Budget Natural Farming, or Community Managed Natural Farming. A number of papers on it now, but as I said, it kind of doesn't matter what it's called. It's about sustainability in agriculture, and it's working there particularly for very small, poor farmers, and that's a really big kind of equality argument to make about this as well.
Yeah, and having a large-scale impact. It sounds
tremendous. I mean, just fabulous, actually.
Yeah.
So, good stuff.
So that relates to your point about be bold, make a difference when you spoke to graduate students. So nice tie-in.
Yeah.
Well, Jules, this has been a really wonderful interview, and I appreciate the chance to interact with a big thinker as you are. And so thank you for your time. Thank you on behalf of all our listeners for your thoughts, and really a privilege.
Been my pleasure. Been lovely to talk, and thanks very much indeed. And good luck to everybody who will lead us into a better future from here. Thanks a lot.
Wonderful. So we've been speaking with Professor Jules Pretty from the University of Essex, and on lots of topics, starting with sustainable intensification, but finishing with future directions for a better world. So thanks once again to listening to Questions in Sustainability, and we look forward to sharing again. Take care.